Hello and welcome back to our reading of Pedagogy of the Oppressed. Where we last left you, we were reading the foreword and the preface of Pedagogy of the Oppressed, the foreword written by a colleague of Paulo Freire's from the United States. And then we also read Paulo Freire's preface to his book, Pedagogy of the Oppressed. This is probably my favorite book. This book is immensely influential for me and my thinking. It is extremely helpful. I'm always catching myself reading it. Today I actually brought the physical copy as well. This is one that I got from a sort of anarchist, communist gathering. And I think that this book is really exciting in terms of just learning about dialogue, which I think is maybe the most important term, the most important idea for conceptualizing how we educate ourselves and others. And with education being perhaps the most important element of revolutionizing the world, changing the world for the better in a significant way, perhaps dialogue is maybe the most important thing. Now, what we're going to get into with this first chapter is an understanding of why dialogue is important. It's an understanding of what it means to be dialogical. But more importantly, it's able to articulate, I think, what's important about listening to people and engaging in true dialogue with them. First, defining what that kind of means, I think you get a real understanding of what that means after reading this chapter. But also understanding beyond a simple sort of maybe liberal mainstream understanding of, well, people deserve to be heard, be polite, be kind, be respectful, respectability politics type of thing, right? And so what Paulo Freire does instead is articulate that revolution has to be dialogical because dialogue is the instrument through which we gain our humanization. And oppression is a force that dehumanizes us inherently, right? So what he articulates is this dehumanization and how we can rehumanize ourselves through education, through dialogue. That's sort of my remembrance of this first chapter. If you read the table of contents, I'll just use the physical copy here so I don't confuse myself by changing it on there. Chapter 1's description says, it's the justification for a pedagogy of the oppressed, the contradiction between the oppressors and the oppressed, and how it is overcome. Oppression and the oppressors, oppression and the oppressed. Liberation. Not a gift, not a self-achievement, but a mutual process. So we'll talk about what that means, but why don't we just get into it? Thank you all for your support. Here we go. And this is from, so if you Google Pedagogy of the Oppressed on this PDF will come up quite quickly. That's where I got it from. I should have noted that last stream, but just so you know, if you want a copy electronically, you can Google it and somebody has provided it for free. That's the envsucsc.edu. So it's a university. Okay. Without further delay. Okay. While the problem of humanization has always, from an axiological point of view, the study of the nature, types, and criteria of values and of value judgments, especially in ethics. While the problem of humanization has always, from an axiological point of view, been humankind's central problem, it now takes on the character of an inescapable concern. So that's one sentence, and then we have our first note, which is long. Let's read the first note. The current movements of rebellion, especially those of youth, while they necessarily reflect the peculiarities of their respective settings, manifest in their essence this preoccupation with people as beings in the world and with the world. Preoccupation with what and how they are being. As they place consumer civilization in judgment, denounce bureaucracies of all types, demand the transformation of the universities, changing the rigid nature of the teacher-student relationship and placing that relationship within the context of reality. Propose the transformation of reality itself, so that universities can be renewed, attack old orders and established institutions, in the attempt to affirm human beings as the subjects of decision. All these movements reflect the style of our age, which is more anthropological than anthropocentric. Without getting too in the weeds, because we're literally just starting the chapter, and I think you'll get a sense for what he's talking about as you read on. I think especially this conclusion kind of gives you a sense. More anthropological than anthropocentric in reference to this the movements reflecting the style of our age. And this is sort of the difference between studying human beings and centering human beings, right? Anthropological rather than anthropocentric. Trying to understand who we are and what we are and how we're doing things and what we're doing and why, right? Maybe not even so much the why. The why is often taken for granted, I think. The who and the what are central topics of philosophy, and they are fascinating subjects, important to understanding theory. There's a bit of that going on in this book. But the point that Freire makes, and maybe the central thing of this book, is that we have to center our humanity, which means, yes, conceptualizing what it means to be human and conceptualizing what it means to further humanize oneself. But more so, I think to understand that we have a target, we have a why, we have a reason, and we need to act with that reason. And that reason is to humanize ourselves and others, to liberate ourselves from oppressive scenarios, from the oppression of the world, which dehumanizes us, right? What's up, fancy? This takes me back to law school. Interesting. Concern for humanization leads at once to the recognition of dehumanization, not only as an ontological possibility, but as an historical reality. And as an individual perceives the extent of dehumanization, he or she may ask if humanization is a viable possibility. Within history, in concrete objective contexts, both humanization and dehumanization are possibilities for a person as an uncompleted being conscious of their incompletion. But while both humanization and dehumanization are real alternatives, only the first is the people's vocation. This vocation is constantly negated, yet it is affirmed by that very negation. It is thwarted by injustice, exploitation, oppression, and the violence of the oppressors. It is affirmed by the yearning of the oppressed for freedom and justice, and by their struggle to recover their lost humanity. So here we're going to start really talking about dehumanization and humanization and what he is referring to. Dehumanization, which marks not only those whose humanity has been stolen, but also, though in a different way, those who have stolen it, is a distortion of the vocation of becoming more fully human. This distortion occurs within history, but it is not an historical vocation. What's up, Eliza? Sorry. Indeed, to admit of dehumanization as an historical vocation would lead either to cynicism or total despair. The struggle for humanization, for the emancipation of labor, for the overcoming of alienation, for the affirmation of men and women as persons, would be meaningless. This struggle is possible only because dehumanization, although a concrete historical fact, is not a given destiny, but the result of an unjust order that engenders violence in the oppressors, which in turn dehumanizes the oppressed. Because it is a distortion of being more fully human, sooner or later being less human leads the oppressed to struggle against those who made them so. In order for this struggle to have meaning, the oppressed must not, in seeking to regain their humanity, which is a way to create it, become in turn oppressors of the oppressors, but rather restorers of the humanity of both. Key point. Key theme. And also something that Freire really kind of delicately articulates and navigates, because it's very easy for this point to be interpreted as maybe the liberal mainstream Michelle Obama idea of they go low, we go high. Don't, violence is always a bad thing, right? Or don't be mean to people even if they're mean to you. This kind of reductivism, right? The sense that, two wrongs don't make a right, and there are some things that we can discuss as absolute wrongs. And so the reality of the oppressed's mission is actually to become the oppressors of the oppressors, and that's why they're ultimately bad and can't be trusted. Or this idea that when you are fighting back against your oppressor in different ways, that you are victimizing them, that you're on an even playing field, and that you're dehumanizing them by simply, for instance, protecting yourself against their violence, their systemic violence, or by boycotting their products, right? This is not Freire's point. Freire is not making this offhand toss away point that, just be nice, or everybody's on equal playing field. Don't be mean to, Freire is making a point that there's a great discord, a great tension between trying to overcome your own oppression by ending the oppression, by working for liberation, or trying to oppress the oppressor, trying to become an oppressor so that you're not the oppressed anymore. This is something that I think you're going to see him articulate more and more, but it's something that I want you to carefully consider. I think it's something that reading this book should be something that you critically deal with in your head all the time. That you don't treat that dogmatically, you don't take that as something quite simple, because even though it is a simple thing to say, it is actually a very complicated process. It's actually very complicated to decide how to actually do it, and we'll sort of talk about that. Because it is... Okay. This, then, is the great humanistic and historical task of the oppressed, to liberate themselves and their oppressors by their oppressors as well. Again, very key points, very kind of radical points, but also need to be very carefully dealt with, very critically assessed. They should constantly toss and turn in your head. The oppressors who oppress, exploit, and rape by virtue of their power cannot find in this power the strength to liberate either the oppressed or themselves. Only power that springs from the weakness of the oppressed will be sufficiently strong to free both. Any attempt to soften the power of the oppressor in deference to the weakness of the oppressed almost always manifests itself in the form of false generosity. Indeed, the attempt never goes beyond this. In order to have the continued opportunity to express their generosity, the oppressors must perpetuate injustice as well. An unjust social order is the permanent fount of this generosity, which is nourished by death, despair, and poverty. That is why the dispensers of false generosity become desperate at the slightest threat to its source. There's like three very key things going on here. Paulo starts chapter 1 spitting, okay? First of all, our task is not to oppress the oppressors. It is to liberate ourselves and them as well. And this does not mean, again, that we should handle this quite recklessly, that we should just say, yes, it's just wrong to do most of the things that it'll take to actually achieve our liberation because it hurts the oppressor in some way. Freire's points are that you have to analyze what you're hurting. When you hurt the oppressor, are you hurting them on basis of dehumanizing them, on basis of exploiting them in this way that makes them lose their autonomy, makes them desperate, makes them traumatized in some highly affecting way, to make them deal with the same thing that you deal with, right? Or are you hurting them in a way that in actuality, on a more absolute realm of understanding, isn't actually hurting them? Let me give you an example. So if I want to get my vengeance on somebody who did something horrible to me, maybe they killed one of my family members. Let's just get real spicy to start. Maybe they killed one of my family members, and that was a horrible thing to do, of course. It wasn't a situation where they were morally ambiguous at all about it. There was not a situation where my family member did something wrong. They killed my family member for very selfish purposes, let's say. And I say, I need to get back at them. This is something we have to analyze. Because they say, revenge is a dish best served cold, but they also say vengeance is something that will never truly satisfy your need for closure, that will ultimately not really do anything better. It just creates a cycle of violence and all these things. They say that self-defense is necessary, but at the same time, that violence is never the answer. So what is it? What is it exactly that's the truth? Well, how do you navigate a situation like this? For one, are you justified in trying to go kill this person that killed your family member? I mean, by a pretty common understanding of justice, of what is just and unjust, sounds pretty just, right? Doesn't mean it's right, but you can understand why a person would do it. You would understand why there's a balance in justice there. Somebody did something horrible, and in return, you are going to do that same horrible thing to them. But, and this is a controversial question, what is it that you are going to accomplish by seeking your revenge in this way? By killing your enemy who has killed your family member, what do you gain? And I want you to understand something. Usually when that question is posited, it's like the end of the sentence. It's like the end of the story. What do you gain? And the implication is you don't gain anything. I'm not really saying that, because in certain situations, yes, taking somebody else's life is not only understandable because of what they've done to you, but is also actually kind of necessary for your survival. I.e., let's say the person that killed your family member is threatening also, whether directly or indirectly, to kill more of your family members. Now, you have far more of a justificatory backing for killing them, because it's not just about, I want them to feel something. It's not just about, I want to get them back. It's about, I need to protect myself and other people in my family, and frankly, other people like me, which is to say, anybody who can be victimized by this type of act. But if the person is not a threat to you anymore, then you have to think critically about, well, what would killing them actually do? This is a very intense example, of course. It seems quite crass to talk about it, especially in this context. I'm definitely not a soldier or a person who has experience with this kind of violence. But it's kind of the most simple and concrete way I can come up with to explain to you what we mean when we talk about liberating ourselves and our oppressors versus oppressing them. Because if you are committing harm to other people, you're a danger to other people. And you're also, frankly, dehumanized. You've done something inhumane. You've done something that is dehumanizing, and you are in the process of continuing to do inhumane, dehumanizing things. You're conceiving of yourself as this thing that is above humanity, which is a person who has the rights to take life for no discernible reason other than the glory and importance of your personal gain. That's not a healthy way to live life, bro. Like, that's not a good thing. And what Fancy's question is, which is, how do you convince the oppressor to accept liberation when their position as oppressor is more favorable to them, is where you have the most critical and difficult questions posed by this book. This is not something that the book will answer to you very easily or very neatly. The book, by saying these things, is at the very least emphasizing the importance of considering that question in every situation. How do you liberate somebody who does not want to be liberated? That's the ultimate question, right? And what we do in different realms with different specializations is try to understand why people would not want to accept liberation. I mean, think about it. Why would you want to live a life in which you are responsible for hurting tons of people just for selfish, worldly, unimportant things like the amount of money you have, right? You ask the average person on the street, and no matter what they tell you, right, there's not really anything that you can gain from being a billionaire who makes their money off of the death of tons of people. And you can supplement this with the anecdotal ideas of, well, these people, you can tell, are also not really very happy in their personal lives. I get that that's up for debates and not necessarily concrete. And I get that from our understanding of how the world works, their positionality is favorable. It's definitely favorable in terms of having their basic needs met and far more. But there is something quite undesirable and dehumanizing about having that at the expense of hurting tons of people. And we can get into tons of reasons why. But the general thing I'm trying to say is, if a person knows what's good for them, they will accept liberation. They will want to be on the path of liberating themselves and other people. That, I think, is... I kind of think that that's maybe non-negotiable as an idea. If we're trying to do this work, because if we're negotiating with that idea and saying, well, I would like to be in the position of a Jeff Bezos, or I would like to be in the position of some type of warlord. Their position is something that I would consider better than mine, and I would prefer to be in it. That's kind of weird. And I think this is one of maybe the most important things that anybody who is left-leaning or leftist in the West has to really address in themselves. Because yes, we can understand that capitalism is a system in which the wealth and resources are concentrated in the hands of a group of people who will do anything to protect that, to ensure that. We can agree with that. And we can agree that there's a totem pole, and some people are at the top and some people are at the bottom. But we need to also realize at some point that being at the top of that totem pole does not equal living a good life or being at your humanized peak or being more humanized. The more you oppress other people, there's not a relationship where you become more humanized and more happy and more fulfilled, and more human. Like, we have to not want to be, you know, insert political leader here. We have to not want to be Donald Trump, right? And if you don't quite work that out in your head, I think, maybe this is a psychological concept that's a bit woo woo, but like, this idea that hurt people, it's real, right? Like, would you genuinely want to be Donald Trump? And so, yes, Donald Trump still wants to be Donald Trump. He's not going to accept liberation from his position. He's not going to accept that, living a different life. But that's when we have to ask why. Because the answer can't simply be because he's living a better life than we are. That answer is not quite sufficient. It makes sense. It's a good shorthand sometimes. But in reality, we are at a very important and very difficult contradiction in our minds to both think that somebody like Donald Trump is the problem, emblematic of the problem with the world, and simultaneously believe that someone like Donald Trump lives a better life than we do. If we don't do enough work to reconcile that difference, that's where we're in trouble. That's where we're in trouble. And maybe we should move on and keep reading, because I've been going on about this now, this first couple of pages for a quite long time, and there's so much more to get into. But that will also be a theme. What does it mean that the oppressor is dehumanized in being the oppressor? Just as, of course, not to, in a lot of cases, a more favorable position or a less favorable position or an equally favorable position as the oppressed, but that they are dehumanized too, and they need to be liberated too. What does that mean? There's also so much more in this passage that I was going to get into. It's key here that he introduces the idea of the generosity, the false generosity. So this, we're not going to move on yet. This I just want to touch on because this is a key concept. And I think, for instance, one of the best ways to understand the false generosity concept is to think about the Mr. Beast problem, right? And this is not, I want you to caution away from this being a sweeping moral judgment of Mr. Beast, because people are complicated, and maybe he's a very nice guy. It certainly seems from a lot of people's articulations that he means very well. I don't know. I can't confirm or deny that. But if you're not aware of what Mr. Beast does, he's this very rich YouTuber who does all these different challenges and these big viral videos, which have a outcome of some type of charity, some type of donation being sent to some type of oppressed people, some type of poor people, or a great prize being given out to somebody who needs it. Surgeries for people who are blind so that they can be able to see, or shoes for people in Africa. And this was huge discourse in 2023, in 2022 and 2023. Big discourse, because leftists would sit there and say, this guy is a jabroni. This guy is exploiting these people. This is stuff that we have to move away from. This is very problematic. And then the common response would be, man, you people don't want to do anything, right? I saw somebody have this discourse recently about NGOs and nonprofits, right? You people just don't want to he's actually doing something to really help these people, and you're not. You're just sitting behind a keyboard and talking. He's actually giving these people help and shoes. And what are you doing? And I think the problem, as in short, we could talk about this more if you want, but in short, I think the big problem is that people think that in this society, generosity and, helping people, appearing to do so, even tangibly doing so, is a one-sided act. People think it only benefits the person you help. when you are generous to a person. So no matter the other conditions, no matter what kinds of cameras you have on and how many views you get on the video about it and all of that, ultimately, that is overruled by the mere fact that you helped a person. And because you helped a person, that is undeniably a one-way thing. And I think people really need to break this down, because it's something that if you think about for 2 seconds, you realize it's bullshit, right? You realize it doesn't make any sense, because everybody knows that there are people, for instance, who will be nice to other people as a way to get something out of it. And that they will help people sometimes in very tangible ways with this strict purpose, or not even a super strict purpose, but at least with some partial purpose of getting things out of it. And I could go on and on about how many places this shows up, and how many places particularly are complete cognitive dissonance about this shows up. In relationships, for instance, where we think, well, this person's nice and they mean well and they're sweet and they do nice things for other people, so they're a good person and I can't criticize them. They should just be upheld as a good person, right? Not even that they're just beyond critique, because people will generally say, oh, nobody's beyond critique. But this person must be good for me, must be a good partner, I must be benefiting from them in my life, etc., etc., because they help me. They do this and this. They give me these gifts, right? They buy me these nice things. And then you see how often that becomes a pattern for somebody abusing somebody else. How many rich boyfriends spoil their girlfriend with these expensive gifts and then use that as a cudgel. Use that as something to hang over somebody else, to hang over their girlfriend, to say, I can do whatever I want because I pay the bills, because I paid for your car, for your phone, for your shoes. You benefit from helping people, 99% of the time, especially when there's a tension towards your helping the other person. But even when not, there's things you can get, like being happier because you feel better about yourself or whatever. And so this is where the false generosity concept is very crucial for what Freire talks about. Because what we see in the case of a Mr. Beast, in the case of these grand corporations, these big nonprofit foundations, Bill Gates and whatever, is an effort to build huge amounts of public gratification, popularity, positive opinion, and also, for instance, tax breaks from helping people. Mr. Beast collaborates with these corporations, much richer than he is, although he's already pretty rich, and helps them to clear their name by putting them in the video as a sponsor who is, out of the kindness and generosity of their work, helping these people, so that you are pushed further and further away from asking, is this company good? Why are these people in this position of being oppressed in the first place, for instance? And if this company has $5 billion, why would they only donate $20,000 to a YouTuber to show that they care about some folks in Africa who, for instance, they might be dependent on for the labor that gets them their raw materials? The Save Africa phenomenon, yes. And there's quite a bit of documentation throughout history of colonizers, imperialists, helping the public, using generosity as an excuse, using false generosity as an excuse to cover up all the negative stuff that they're doing. It builds them political power. And so this line, an unjust social order is the permanent fount of this generosity, which is nourished by death, despair, and poverty. That is why the dispensers of false generosity become desperate at the slightest threat to its source. You're so generous, you wouldn't mind if we came and took more of your money, right? Because we need it for the village that harboring your factory that you use to produce this stuff. No, we send in the police. We're violently stomping you out. You know what I mean? We're not going to listen to you talk at all. And then we're going to point you to the generosity. Look at the $50,000 donation we gave to Mr. Beast so that a few people could get shoes. So that you don't feel as inclined to recognize how much bad stuff we're doing. And moreover, if we look like we're doing the right thing with all this stuff that we stole, then we can justify continuing to steal it. If I keep stealing everybody in the neighborhood's money, and then I go out and I buy people some nice gifts for Christmas and make a nice little public photo op about it, I can continue to convince people, hey, you know what? Just let him keep stealing from the people in the neighborhood because he's doing nice things with it. Wow. Some aggressive neck cracking. Our colonialism, imperialism made your people in better condition. Exactly, April. Okay, so I should go on. But yes, these are two key concepts to think about. How do we liberate people who don't want to be liberated, i.e. our oppressors, but often also the oppressed? We'll get into it. How do we convince them to be liberated? And how do we think about this notion of generosity? How can we locate false generosity? True generosity consists precisely in fighting to destroy the causes which nourish false charity. False charity constrains the fearful and subdued, the rejects of life, to extend their trembling hands. True generosity lies in striving so that these hands, whether of individuals or entire peoples, need be extended less and less in supplication, so that more and more they become human hands which work and, working, transform the world. This lesson and this apprenticeship must come, however, from the oppressed themselves and from those who are truly solidary with them. As individuals or as peoples, by fighting for the restoration of their humanity, they will be attempting the restoration of true generosity. Who are better prepared than the oppressed to understand the terrible significance of an oppressive society? Who suffer the effects of oppression more than the oppressed? Who can better understand the necessity of liberation? They will not gain this liberation by chance, but through the praxis of their quest for it, through their recognition of the necessity to fight for it. And this fight, because of the purpose given it by the oppressed, will actually constitute an act of love, opposing the lovelessness which lies at the heart of the oppressor's violence. Lovelessness, even when clothed in false generosity. See you, April. Have fun at the rally. So, key thing here is understanding that this is an important commentary on the difference between movements that are from bottom up and from top down. And often there are these quite lengthy debates about how much we should trust the oppressed, and not just getting into just the oppressed categories of a person, the marginalized categories of a person, to explain why we should listen to them. For instance, listen to black people about anti-blackness. Well, what about if the black person is a black capitalist? What about if the black person is, a staunch black conservative who actually thinks a lot of anti-blackness is not really anti-blackness or is good, right? So we all kind of know that there are these conditions that would allow us to think critically about who we're allowing to get the platform, who we should have leading our movements, besides just that they come from an oppressed background, a marginalized category. But it is acting as somebody in the position of the oppressed, conscious of being oppressed, and doing something to change that oppression, right? Proposing solutions, fighting for things that, when done truly, right, is almost basically always a guide, right? There's just a difference between somebody who is oppressed, fighting for equal rights in a society, versus somebody who is oppressed, fighting for benefits for a specific part a specific class of that oppressed category. That's an example. You would have loved Lula's comeback. But almost always, during the initial stage of the struggle, the oppressed, instead of striving for liberation, tend themselves to become oppressors or sub-oppressors. The very structure of their thought has been conditioned by the contradictions of the concrete existential situation by which they were shaped. Their ideal is to be men, but for them, to be men is to be oppressors. And of course, here we're talking about humans as men. Freire does a decent job in this book of toggling between men and women and he and she pronouns. Of course, we understand that there are also a wide variety of different gender identities that wasn't quite part of popular discourse when Freire was writing this. But yes, when you see men here, right, we're talking about as an example to lead to the understanding of we're talking about humanization, humans. This phenomenon derives from the fact that the oppressed, at a certain moment of their existential experience, adopt an attitude of adhesion to the oppressor. Under these circumstances, they cannot consider him sufficiently clearly to objectivize him, to discover him outside themselves. This does not necessarily mean that the oppressed are unaware that they are downtrodden, but their perception of themselves as oppressed is impaired by their submersion in the reality of oppression. At this level, their perception of themselves as opposites of the oppressor does not yet signify engagement in a struggle to overcome the contradiction. The one pole aspires not to liberation, but to identification with its opposite pole. Note 2, as used throughout this book, the term contradiction denotes the dialectical conflict between opposing social forces. That's a translator's note. So rather than, the poles wanting to escape that polarity, wanting to emerge from that polarity of oppressed versus oppressor, there is a identification with its opposite pole. You can't want to be liberated if your idea of what it means to be liberated is to be an oppressor. If your idea is, I want to be liberated like Tyler, the Creator. I want to be liberated like Daniel Day Kim or something. That's not it. That's not quite it. Yeah, there's some malcitations that come up as well. Belavanti. In this situation, John Belavanti, sorry, I don't know why I called you by your last name. In this situation, the oppressed do not see the new man as the person to be born from the resolution of this contradiction, as oppression gives way to liberation. For them, the new man or woman themselves become oppressors. Their vision of the new man or woman is individualistic. Because of their identification with the oppressor, they have no consciousness of themselves as persons or members of an oppressed class. It is not to become free that they want agrarian reform, but in order to acquire land and thus become landowners, or more precisely, bosses over other workers. It is a rare peasant who, once promoted to overseer, does not become more of a tyrant towards his former comrades than the owner himself. This is because the context of the peasant's situation, that is, oppression, remains unchanged. In this example, the overseer, in order to make sure of his job, must be as tough as the owner, and more so. Thus is illustrated our previous assertion that during the initial stage of their struggle, the oppressed find in the oppressor their model of manhood. Kind of see what's going on, right? Deputy White in South Africa. Yeah, I see what you mean by that. Hello, Ivy. Even revolution, which transforms a concrete situation of oppression by establishing the process of liberation, must confront this phenomenon. Many of the oppressed who directly or indirectly participate in revolution intend, conditioned by the myths of the old order, to make it their private revolution. The shadow of their former oppressor is still cast over them. So I want you to think about, what are those myths of the old order? What are those ways in which we can end up being oppressors, even as we're in the process of having revolution? And, speaking of South Africa, thinking about like the ways in which what Walter Rodney referred to as the flag revolutions throughout the African continent of the 20th century, all these different African nations gaining their independence from colonial rule. What were the issues that followed? What came next when Nigeria got its independence? What came next when South Africa ended apartheid, right? What were the issues that happened afterwards? The fear of freedom which afflicts the oppressed, a fear which may equally well lead them to desire the role of oppressor or bind them to the role of oppressed, should be examined. Note 3, this fear of freedom is also to be found in the oppressors, though obviously in a different form. The oppressed are afraid to embrace freedom. The oppressors are afraid of losing the freedom to oppress. It's interesting this is a note, because I think this is a great, succinct explanation of what I've been talking about. The oppressed are afraid to embrace freedom. The oppressors are afraid of losing the freedom to oppress. And putting freedom in quotes there brings home the point that oppressing other people is not freedom. Oppressing other people is not freedom. It is not autonomy. One of the basic elements of the relationship between oppressor and oppressed is prescription. Every prescription represents the imposition of one individual's choice upon another, transforming the consciousness of the person prescribed to into one that conforms with the prescriber's consciousness. Thus, the behavior of the oppressed is a prescribed behavior, following as it does the guidelines of the oppressor. The oppressed, having internalized the image of the oppressor and adopted his guidelines, are fearful of freedom. Freedom would require them to eject this image and replace it with autonomy and responsibility. Freedom is acquired by conquest, not by gift. It must be pursued constantly and responsibly. I'm big on time and how we have to change our understanding of temporal stuff. So the word constantly here is very important to me. Freedom is not an ideal located outside of man. Nor is it an idea which becomes myth. It is rather the indispensable condition for the quest for human completion. To surmount the situation of oppression, people must first critically recognize its causes, so that through transforming action they can create a new situation, one which makes possible the pursuit of a fuller humanity. But the struggle to be more fully human has already begun in the authentic struggle to transform the situation. Although the situation of oppression is a dehumanized and dehumanizing totality affecting both the oppressors and those whom they oppress, it is the latter who must, from their stifled humanity, wage for both the struggle for a fuller humanity. The oppressor, who is himself dehumanized because he dehumanizes others, is unable to lead this struggle. Do you see what's happening there? This is very logical, philosophical stuff. This is very mathematical. This is tautological, right? The oppressed is dehumanized because the oppressor dehumanizes them. The oppressor is dehumanized because he dehumanizes others. And so that is why the oppressor can't lead liberation movements. And so this makes you have to think, what are we talking about with these categories of oppressed and oppressor? Are we talking about static things? Are we talking about a single person? Are we saying, for instance, let's speak super flippantly and theoretically. Ooh, I just hit myself in the face while trying to roll up my sleeve. Jeff Bezos, richest guy in the world. Can he never lead a liberation movement? Basically, no, he can't. Unless he gave up all of his assets and began fighting capitalism as a member of the oppressed. He cannot fight capitalism from his position as not only a capitalist, but the richest capitalist in the world. He can't do it. Why? Because he's literally doing the thing. And so thus he's dehumanized. Why? Because he is dehumanizing other people. The things that happen for Amazon to make the amount of money that they do, let's say. The poor Indian workers in control of the AI quote unquote facility that people were talking about recently, right? How many people are dehumanized because of Amazon? Because of what they do. Not just the examples of how they work people, but just systemically. A bajillion-dollar company. You know, it doesn't make sense. Right? So this idea that somebody who is super rich can simply fix the world is, according to Freire, on its face, incorrect. It's just never correct. It's never the right idea. The only people who can save the world are those who are in need of saving, are those who are oppressed. The only people who can end oppression are the oppressed. So why I said yes, basically, but not yes, absolutely, Jeff Bezos cannot lead the revolution or be a part of the revolution, is because if Jeff Bezos were to end all the different things in his life that relied on the dehumanization of other people, he would then be in solidarity with, at the very least, the oppressed. Right? And there's a lot there. The key thing to understand is that oppressed is a category that you inhibit, that you embody in a situation. It is not something that is static. It's not something that's fixed to you. It's not something that will always be the case. Just as in the case of the oppressor, or the oppressed, often becoming oppressors. Right? And there can be situations in which we are oppressors and situations in which we're oppressed. Right? Julie says, Freddy's point is not so focused on people like Bezos, but more on us, and why we should never strive to be that ultra rich. Exactly. Like, that's not a thing. You know, that's not a thing that we can ever want to be if we want to be human, if he wants to be humanized. Because in order to be ultra rich, we have to dehumanize others. Right? There's so much there. I'm just going to keep reading, but an idea to keep in mind. And yeah, I mean, feel free to ask questions and make comments continuously. I appreciate that from y'all. To surmount the situation of oppression. Oh, wait, I said that already? Sorry. However, the oppressed who have adapted to the structure of domination in which they are immersed and have become resigned to it are inhibited from waging the struggle for freedom so long as they feel incapable of running the risks it requires. Moreover, their struggle for freedom threatens not only the oppressor, but also their own oppressed comrades, who are fearful of still greater repression. When they discover within themselves the yearning to be free, they perceive that this yearning can be transformed into reality only when the same yearning is aroused in their comrades. But while dominated by the fear of freedom, they refuse to appeal to others, or to listen to the appeals of others, or even to the appeals of their own conscience. They prefer gregariousness to authentic comradeship. They prefer the security of conformity with their state of unfreedom to the creative communion produced by freedom, and even the very pursuit of freedom. The oppressed suffer from the duality which has established itself in their innermost being. They discover that without freedom, they cannot exist authentically. Yet, although they desire authentic existence, they fear it. They are at one and the same time themselves and the oppressor, whose consciousness they have internalized. The conflict lies in the choice between being wholly themselves or being divided. between ejecting the oppressor within or not ejecting them, between human solidarity or alienation, between following prescriptions or having choices, between being spectators or actors, between acting or having the illusion of acting through the action of the oppressors, between speaking out or being silent, castrated in their power to create and recreate, in their power to transform the world. This is the tragic dilemma of the oppressed, which their education must take into account. So, if you've ever heard the phrase, kill the cop inside of you, this book will present some aspects of what the writer has termed the pedagogy of the oppressed, a pedagogy which must be forged with, not for, the oppressed, whether individuals, or peoples, in the incessant struggle to regain their humanity. This pedagogy makes oppression and its causes objects of reflection by the oppressed, and from that reflection will come their necessary engagement in the struggle for their liberation. And in the struggle, this pedagogy will be made and remade. The central problem is this: how can the oppressed, as divided, unauthentic beings, participate in developing the pedagogy of their liberation? Only as they discover themselves to be hosts of the oppressor can they contribute to the midwifery of their liberating pedagogy. As long as they live in the duality in which to be is to be like, and to be like is to be like the oppressor, this contribution is impossible. The pedagogy of the oppressed is an instrument for their critical discovery that both they and their oppressors are manifestations of dehumanization. And I'll note that this is why it's important to have what people say is a radical imagination, to be able to imagine better worlds, even if you're not capable of figuring out how to get there. It's so important to maintain a radical imagination, just in a way that, for instance, if you've been treated like shit your whole life, and you've had a really shitty life your whole life, it is important to have the imagination of your life being better. It's important to do so. Because if you're constantly just drawing from what is quote unquote actual, what is in front of you, the material situation, the context in front of you, then how will you ever be able to know anything outside of that? And there are concrete examples of this, in smaller senses. Like if you've never left your town, you've never left your village, you have to have the imagination first that there's a big world out there that's worth seeing outside of your village before actually making that choice to go and see that world. Because if you're convinced that that village is a reflection of ultimately what humanity is for you, what life is for you, that you're never going to really see anything beyond that, because you've never seen anything beyond that, and because thus it's irrational to think that there's something beyond that, then you'll never even open yourself up when you have the opportunity to see something else. Because to you, your only instinct is to see things as like other things you already know. You have no capacity, no imagination for understanding things as they actually are, even though they're going to be things that you oftentimes are going to take so long to understand in any real way. You won't even get on that journey. You won't even be on that process if you don't have the imagination. And so as long as they live in the duality in which to be is to be like, and to be like is to be like the oppressor, this contribution is impossible. You have to imagine that humanity, the world as it exists so far, is a village. And that liberation is the world outside of that village, as an example. There's something outside of this. There's something more than this. And we can get there. Similarly, you have to have that idea in mind. There's more that I can know. There's more that I can know. There's more that I can learn. There's more out there for me. Sorry, I'm starting to play with my hair, and that's always a big problem. Let's move. Liberation is thus a childbirth and a painful one. The man or woman who emerges is a new person, viable only as the oppressor-oppressed contradiction is superseded by the humanization of all people. By the humanization of all people. Or to put it another way, the solution of this contradiction is born in the labor which brings into the world this new being, no longer oppressor nor longer oppressed, but human in the process of achieving freedom. So having that imagination and choosing to walk on that path is what makes you realize yourself as human, right? You know, another way to conceive this, right? We know that nobody is perfect. We know that humans aren't perfect. We know that nobody can play God. Nobody can read other people's minds. Nobody can know exactly what to do in every situation. So to be an actor in your life that is constantly making decisions for other people, that is constantly only considering your own perspective as if it's the only perspective that matters, that is dehumanization. That is you dehumanizing yourself and the people around you, right? You're only human when you realize that you're not perfect and you realize where you are. Because to not engage with your imperfections is to not see yourself as human. Because humans are, by fact, not perfect, right? And even not even just by fact, right? Because maybe even you can argue that one day maybe humans will be perfect, or something that we will benefit from considering perfect. Maybe that is part of your radical imagination. Regardless, recognizing that you're not perfect is one of these examples of a way that you humanize yourself. This solution cannot be achieved in idealistic terms. In order for the oppressed to be able to wage the struggle for their liberation, they must perceive the reality of oppression not as a closed world from which there is no exit, but as a limiting situation which they can transform. This is a big term, limiting situation / limit situation. When I made that metaphor about the village, imagine humanity as a village, your life as a village that you haven't left outside of yet. There's a big world outside of that village. That's what this is. What this basically means. It's a limit situation. The way the world is right now is not the way that the world will always be. That is a fact. When we operate as if we know the way that the world will always be, as if we know it will always be this, that is dehumanizing. And that is an example of us just cutting off our road to liberation. It's dehumanizing ourselves. It's taking us away from liberation. Why? Because we're not recognizing basic science, basic fact, that this world is going to continuously change. That the situation we find ourselves in now is not permanent. You can only understand how to deal with your own sadness if you know that the sadness isn't permanent. If you know that the sadness will go away. But if you convince yourself, as many people often do, because it is easier to do so, right? That the sadness is just what life is, and it'll ultimately always be that way. You're taking yourself away from the path of liberation. Because you're recognizing a limit situation, a situation that is limited, that can be transformed. When you see that and instead say, I can't transform it, it is a closed world from which there is no exit, then you've lost the plot. This perception is a necessary but not a sufficient condition for liberation. It must become the motivating force for liberating action. Nor does the discovery by the oppressed that they exist in dialectical relationship to the oppressor, as his antithesis, that without them the oppressor could not exist, in itself constitute liberation. And this is a citation of Hegel here. The oppressed can overcome the contradiction in which they are caught only when this perception enlists them in the struggle to free themselves. The same is true with respect to the individual oppressor as a person. Discovering himself to be an oppressor may cause considerable anguish, but it does not necessarily lead to solidarity with the oppressed. Rationalizing his guilt through paternalistic treatment of the oppressed, all the while holding them fast in a position of dependence, will not do. Solidarity requires that one enter into the situation of those with whom one is solidary. It is a radical posture. If what characterizes the oppressed is their subordination to the consciousness of the master, as Hegel affirms, true solidarity with the oppressed means fighting at their side to transform the objective reality which has made them these beings for another. Note 5, analyzing the dialectical relationship between the consciousness of the master and the consciousness of the oppressed, Hegel states, the one is independent, and its essential nature is to be for itself. The other is dependent, and its essence is life or existence for another. The former is the master or lord, the latter the bondsman. So you see the key thing that Freire is talking about here and why he's going to Hegel. The subject and object thing again. If you try as the person in a position of power to make decisions for other people, basically, and to say, I'm going to change the world for the better from this position of power, not just position of power, let's use a more specific term, from this position in which I am oppressing other people, then you're not going to be fighting by their side. And if you're not fighting by their side, then you're fighting against them, right? Because they're the only ones who can fight for liberation. And you're the one who's seeing them as an object. Because to you, you're the one who acts. They are the ones who are acted on. And so the only way to participate in that changing is to stop acting on them and to start recognizing their action just as valid, as subject, as having as much subjecthood as your action, right? The oppressor is solidary with the oppressed only when he stops regarding the oppressed as an abstract category and sees them as persons who have been unjustly dealt with, deprived of their voice, cheated in the sale of their labor. When he stops making pious, sentimental, and individualistic gestures and risks an act of love. True solidarity is found only in the plenitude of this act of love, in its existentiality, in its praxis. To affirm that men and women are persons, and as persons should be free, and yet to do nothing tangible to make this affirmation a reality is a farce. Since it is a concrete situation that the oppressor-oppressed contradiction is established, the resolution of this contradiction must be objectively verifiable. Hence, the radical requirement, both for the individual who discovers himself or herself to be an oppressor and for the oppressed, that the concrete situation which begets oppression must be transformed. The concrete situation which begets oppression must be transformed. It's objectively verifiable. You can see it. You can see the fact that you make all this money while other people suffer, and that their labor is part of what makes you all this money. You can objectively verify that. So now what are you going to do? Because if you don't act to transform that concrete situation now, you're still not doing anything. To present this radical demand for the objective transformation of reality, to combat subjectivist immobility which would divert the recognition of oppression into patient waiting for oppression to disappear by itself, is not to dismiss the role of subjectivity in the struggle to change structures. On the contrary, one cannot conceive of objectivity without subjectivity. Neither can exist without the other, nor can they be dichotomized. Difference between a dialectic and a dichotomy. They feed each other dialectically. They need each other. They don't exist without the other. It's not one or the other. It's necessarily both. There are oppressed people because there are oppressors, and vice versa. The separation of objectivity from subjectivity, the denial of the latter when analyzing reality or acting upon it, is objectivism. On the other hand, the denial of objectivity in analysis or action, resulting in a subjectivism which leads to solipsistic positions, denies action itself by denying objective reality. Let's look up solipsistic real quick, because I kind of know what this means, but I want to focus on their own wants and needs, that they don't think about other people at all. You need subjectivity and you need objectivity, right? Neither objectivism nor subjectivism, nor yet psychologism is propounded here, but rather subjectivity and objectivity in constant dialectical relationship. To deny the importance of subjectivity in the process of transforming the world and history is naive and simplistic. It is to admit the impossible, a world without people. Because to be human, you have to have subjectivity. Right? You have to have both. You have to have subjectivity and objectivity. You have to have your own consciousness that makes choices, that acts on the world. And you have to also recognize yourself as an object to everything else that exists in the world, acted upon. You have to have both. If you want to act like everything is objective, anything is objectively verifiable, anything that's subjective is not worth dealing with, guess what? You've just thought of a world that doesn't exist. You've thought of a world without people, and you're a person in it. So what now? This objectivistic position is as ingenuous as that of subjectivism, which postulates people without a world. Oh, everybody's got a thing. Subjectivism. Oh, everybody's got their thing. Everybody's opinion is valid. Everybody's thing is valid. Well, no, it's not. There's a world that actually exists where objective things that we can agree on happen. And they affect people in ways that we can agree on. People are objects in this world as well, which leads them to, and leads their subjectivity often to, making these choices. A person forms their opinion about trans people because they're raised in a right-wing environment that hates trans people, that hates queerness. That's not their subjectivity. That's not just all them. It's whatever, it's all them. That's literally a process. That's literally them in a process. They're a result. And that's the same thing we can say of ourselves. We are all results. And we are all also results takers, I guess you could say. Scientists. World and human beings do not exist apart from each other. They exist in constant interaction. Marx does not espouse such a dichotomy, nor does any other critical, realistic thinker. What Marx criticized and scientifically destroyed was not just subjectivity, but subjectivism and psychologism. Just as objective social reality exists not by chance, but as the product of human action, so it is not transformed by chance. If humankind produce social reality, which in the inversion of the praxis turns back upon them and conditions them, then transforming that reality is a historical task, a task for humanity. Reality which becomes oppressive results in the contradistinction of men as oppressors and oppressed. The latter, whose task it is to struggle for their liberation together with those who show true solidarity, must acquire a critical awareness of oppression through the praxis of this struggle. One of the gravest obstacles to the achievement of liberation is that oppressive reality absorbs those within it and thereby acts to submerge human beings' consciousness. Note 6. Liberating action necessarily involves a moment of perception and volition. This action both precedes and follows that moment, to which it first acts as a prologue, and which it subsequently serves to effect and continue within history. The action of domination, however, does not necessarily imply this dimension, for the structure of domination is maintained by its own mechanical and unconscious functionality. From an unpublished work by Jose Luis Fiori, who has kindly granted permission to quote him. I know this is all a little bit complicated, but just hang with it. Keep diving. Hope everybody's doing well. Functionally, oppression is domesticating. To no longer be prey to its force, one must emerge from it and turn upon it. This can be done only by means of the praxis, reflection, and action upon the world in order to transform it. Now here you have a quote in Spanish. I'll read it really quickly. Hay que hacer a la opresión real todavía más opresiva, añadiendo a aquella la conciencia de la opresión, haciendo la infamia todavía más infamante al pregonarla. And that's from Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, La Sagrada Familia y otros escritos, Mexico, 1962. Emphasis added. Making real oppression more oppressive still by adding to it the realization of oppression corresponds to the dialectical relation between the subjective and the objective. So yeah, this is what the quote essentially is saying, right? You will have to make to the oppression, to the real oppression, I forgot what añadir means. I'm not gonna lie. Adding to it the conscious of the oppression, making the the infamia is like infamy, but I feel like this means like sort of like the oppressive situation, the oppression more oppressive, right? So making a real oppression more oppressive still by adding to it the realization of oppression. Okay, the Español. Yes, thank you, Miguel. Realizing oppression is far from the end of oppression, right? Understanding it is not enough, right? You can actually make it worse by that understanding if you are not constantly understanding the difference between subjective and objective. And this is a problem with a lot of leftist thought that reifies oppression because it takes oppression as objective fully. People will act this way. This is the sectarianism, right? People will always act this way. They're always going to do this. The world is always going to shake out this way if this happens. That's only just going to make things worse, because not only is that a bad reading, but it also just reinforces that people should just act the way they already do. The people should not continuously get more subjectivity and change the way that they behave in their environments. Right? I think you know what I mean. Only in this interdependence is an authentic praxis possible, without which it is impossible to resolve the oppressor-oppressed contradiction. To achieve this goal, the oppressed must confront reality critically, simultaneously objectifying and acting upon that reality. A mere perception of reality not followed by this critical intervention will not lead to a transformation of objective reality, precisely because it is not a true perception. This is the case of a purely subjectivist perception by someone who forsakes objective reality and creates a false substitute. So, Freire says if you recognize oppression as existing, the oppressor-oppressed contradiction even, but you don't actually then realize that you have to confront that as a subject and as an object to act upon that reality, then you haven't really realized it. If you just read it in a book and you say, "Huh, that's interesting," then you're not really acting on it as something that actually exists in the real world. A good example of this phenomenon is choice feminism. I think that's a great example, right? Which again is not to say yes. It's not to say women don't should not make choices, should never make certain choices because they are always misogynistic. They're always leading to the oppression of women. But it's also not to say women can just choose whatever they want, right? This is sometimes the polarity that people use to describe that common sort of tension between feminist analyses, which will recognize that oppression of women is real. And then on one hand, we'll try to make it completely this objective thing where you can just solve how to fix it by yourself. You can just recognize what people need to do immediately. And that if they do certain things, that just means that they're not getting it. That's you not trying to understand the subjectivity of who you're talking about, right? And likewise, if you're just a choice feminist who just thinks, yeah, so then, but like you could just let women do what they want because they suffer enough in this reality. You're then saying, well, yeah, it's bad, but should people actually make these changes in their thought and their decisions to do something about it? No. You know, same thing with like no ethical consumption under capitalism, right? That phrase is very bastardized to the point of it being almost like pointless at this point. Because people will use that as some type of way to say, so I can just act how I want. I can just buy what I want. I can just do what I want because there's no ethical consumption under capitalism. No, sir, that is, you have not understood the lesson. You are not an anti-capitalist. You are not anti-oppression. You are not liberated. You know, what you are is a person who has forgotten the dialectic because there are things that you can do. And also you can't do everything for everybody. You're going to constantly be negotiating that tension for the rest of your life. And if you choose to put it down and act like it's not there, then that's the very moment where for however amount of time that you're doing that, you're not going to be liberated. You know? Yeah. Choice feminism is also a lot of that too. Well, you can just become the oppressor. That's the way out. Just, you know, isn't it great because that the situation of oppression exists. And so when women get CEO jobs at dangerous companies, that's a good thing. A little water. Brazil mentioned. Brazil. A different type of false perception occurs when a change in objective reality would threaten the individual or class interests of the perceiver. Bing, 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 bong, bong, bong. In the first instance, there is no critical intervention in reality because that reality is fictitious. There is none in the second instance because intervention would contradict the class interests of the perceiver. In the latter case, the tendency of the perceiver is to behave neurotically, in quotes. The fact exists, but both the fact and what may result from it may be prejudicial to the person. Thus it becomes necessary, not precisely to deny the fact, but to see it differently. This rationalization as a defense mechanism coincides in the end with subjectivism. A fact which is not denied but whose truths are rationalized loses its objective base. It ceases to be concrete and becomes a myth created in defense of the class of the perceiver. That's super fucking deep. There's lots of layers there. I'm telling you, like this book is so much. You know, he's saying a change in objective reality would threaten the individual or class interests of the perceiver. For instance, something that would take money out of your pocket as a CEO. As a person who is, you know, some type of capitalist. Let's say part of a marginalized group. You get a false perception of your oppression. Intervening in the way that the world works is actually contradicting your class interests. So they behave neurotically. Both the fact and what may result from it may be prejudicial to the person. It becomes necessary not precisely to deny the fact, but to see it differently. Well, I see it differently, Like, yeah, workers are oppressed, and that is part of a great deal of what it leads to the oppression of people in my marginalized background. But like, I see it differently, like honestly, like, it's an opportunity. It's a way for us to just, like, take the circumstance and like make something of it. Or, you know what, this actually is why we are the chosen people of God, because we're suffering, and we got to just step up and like suffer. You know what I mean? Which, like, I have sympathy to some degree for that point of view, because sometimes it is like, okay, let's accept our challenges and work within them, but not like that. Not like just to reject the acceptance of the challenge to begin with, and just to say, well, we're just gonna do what we want. We just are just gonna put ourselves in the position of being the oppressor. This doesn't work. A fact which is not denied, but whose truths are rationalized, loses its objective base. Yes, we oppress black people in America, but that's just because white people are inherently devils who will never be better, right? Yes, anti-Semitism is a problem worldwide, but that's just because nations are not constructed by people who like Jews. It's just never going to happen. Jews will just never be able to commingle with other people. Jewish people will always be unable to live with, Christian Europeans and Muslims. And so maybe they just need to, have a nation of their own and, its own theocratic ethno-state. You see where I'm going with this, right? Herein lies one of the reasons for the prohibitions and the difficulties, to be discussed at length in Chapter 4, designed to dissuade the people from critical intervention in reality. The oppressor knows full well that his intervention would not be to his interest. What is to his interest is for the people to continue in a state of submersion, impotent in the face of oppressive reality. Of relevance here is Lukács's warning to the Revolutionary Party. This is in French. Il doit pour employer le mot de Marx expliquer aux masses. Yeah, I'm not going to be able to do that. In affirming this, that's from Lukács's Lenin. I do wish we had like a translation there, but he'll kind of translate in the next paragraph. Just to let you know. In affirming this necessity, Lukács is unquestionably posing the problem of critical intervention. To explain to the masses their own action, quoting, is to clarify and illuminate that action, both regarding its relationship to the objective facts by which it was prompted and regarding its purposes. The more people unveil this challenging reality which is to be the object of their transforming action, the more critically they enter that reality. In this way, they are consciously activating the subsequent development of their experiences. There would be no human action if there were no objective reality, no world to be the not I of the person and to challenge them. Just as there would be no human action if humankind were not a project, if he or she were not able to transcend himself or herself, if one were not able to perceive reality and understand it in order to transform it. In dialectical thought, world and action are intimately interdependent. But action is human only when it is not merely an occupation, but also a preoccupation. That is, when it is not dichotomized from reflection. Reflection, which is essential to action, is implicit in Lukács's requirement of explaining to the masses their own action, just as it is implicit in the purpose he attributes to this explanation, that of consciously activating the subsequent development of experience. For us, however, the requirement is seen not in terms of explaining to, but rather dialoguing with the people about their actions. In any event, no reality transforms itself, and the duty which Lukács ascribes to the Revolutionary Party of explaining to the masses their own action coincides with our affirmation of the need for the critical intervention of the people in reality through the praxis. The materialist doctrine that men are this is note 9, sorry. Note 9, the materialist doctrine that men are the products of circumstances and upbringing, and that therefore changed men are products of other circumstances and changed upbringing, forgets that it is men that change circumstances, and that the educator himself needs educating. Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, Selected Works. So yeah, no reality transforms itself. And so people need to change the reality. But in order to do that, they have to understand what the reality is and what their position is in it. Right? Which is in itself not ever a static thing. It's a constant process, because even the educator himself needs educating. And we get into this more as this book goes on. One of the central things of this book, the educator needs educating, always. And those who recognize or begin to recognize themselves as oppressed must be among the developers of this pedagogy. No pedagogy which is truly liberating can remain distant from the oppressed by treating them as unfortunates and by presenting for their emulation models from among the oppressors. The oppressed must be their own example in the struggle for their redemption. I think that won't be necessary, since we're kind of what Freire says in the text is kind of getting at the point more so. It kind of gets at what we need. But thank you so much. The pedagogy of the oppressed, animated by authentic humanist, not humanitarian generosity, see that distinction, presents itself as a pedagogy of humankind. Pedagogy which begins with the egoistic interests of the oppressors, an egoism cloaked in the false generosity of paternalism, and makes of the oppressed the objects of its humanitarianism, itself maintains and embodies oppression. It is an instrument of dehumanization. This is why, as we affirmed earlier, the pedagogy of the oppressed cannot be developed or practiced by the oppressors. It would be a contradiction in terms if the oppressors not only defended, but actually implemented a liberating education. The oppressors can't do it. They can't liberate, because their whole thing is existing as a class that makes other people not liberated. Excuse me. That dehumanizes others. But if the implementation of a liberating education requires political power and the oppressed have none, how then is it possible to carry out the pedagogy of the oppressed prior to the revolution? This is a question of the greatest importance, the reply to which is at least tentatively outlined in chapter 4. So we'll get there. One aspect of the reply is to be found in the distinction between systematic education, which can only be changed by political power, and educational projects, which should be carried out with the oppressed in the process of organizing them. The pedagogy of the oppressed, as a humanist and libertarian pedagogy, has two distinct stages. In the first, the oppressed unveil the world of oppression and through the praxis commit themselves to its transformation. In the second stage, in which the reality of oppression has already been transformed, the pedagogy ceases to belong to the oppressed and becomes a pedagogy of all people in the process of permanent liberation. In both stages, it is always through action in depth that the culture of domination is culturally confronted. Note 10, this appears to be the fundamental aspect of Mao's cultural revolution. In the first stage, this confrontation occurs through the change in the way the oppressed perceive the world of oppression. In the second stage, through the expulsion of the myths created and developed in the old order, which, like specters, haunt the new structure emerging from the revolutionary transformation. Yeah, this is giving Mao. It's giving Mao, right? In the sense, you don't just get revolution when you get the revolution. The revolution is not the revolution. The revolution is ongoing. You're never done fighting. You're never done learning. You're never done thinking. The pedagogy of the first stage must deal with the problem of the oppressed consciousness and the oppressor consciousness, the problem of men and women who oppress and men and women who suffer oppression. It must take into account their behavior, their view of the world, and their ethics. A particular problem is the duality of the oppressed. They are contradictory, divided beings, shaped by and existing in a concrete situation of oppression and violence. Any situation in which A objectively exploits B or hinders his and her pursuit of self-affirmation as a responsible person is one of oppression. Here you have a definition of oppression from Freire. Such a situation in itself constitutes violence, even when sweetened by false generosity, because it interferes with the individual's ontological and historical vocation to be more fully human. So this oppression is violence. In itself, it constitutes violence, even if the oppressor seems really sweet and does a lot of donations. With the establishment of a relationship of oppression, violence has already begun. Never in history has violence been initiated by the oppressed. How could they be the initiators if they themselves are the result of violence? How could they be the sponsors of something whose objective inauguration called forth their existence as oppressed? There would be no oppressed had there been no prior situation of violence to establish their subjugation. Key things here, right? Makes you think a lot about ongoing events in real life, right? Thank you so much for the translation, Leo. The Lukács's quote in English: he needs to employ the words of Marx to explain to the masses their own actions, not only to assure the continuity of the revolutionary experiments of the proletariat, but also to consciously activate the future development of those experiments. So that was the quote in French from earlier by Lukács that Freire talks about. You didn't have to do that. That was very kind of you. Thank you, Leo. Back to the book. Violence is initiated by those who oppress, who exploit, who fail to recognize others as persons, not by those who are oppressed, exploited, and unrecognized. It is not the unloved who initiate disaffection, but those who cannot love, because they love only themselves. That's not just like a hit tweet, By being a person whose whole state in life is that you dehumanize yourself because you have to dehumanize other people. Your whole thing is, I have to dehumanize other people. You won't let go of that. Who do you love other than yourself? Because who do you care about other than yourself, other than your own gain? Right? Oh, well, I need to feed my family. You can't feed your family by being oppressed. The oppressed feed their families very often, right? It is not the helpless subject to terror who initiate terror, but the violent who with their power create the concrete situation which begets the rejects of life. It is not the tyrannized who initiate despotism, but the tyrants. It is not the despised who initiate hatred, but those who despise. It is not those whose humanity is denied them who negate humankind, but those who denied that humanity, thus negating their own as well. Force is used not by those who have become weak under the preponderance of the strong, but by the strong who have emasculated them. And so, getting back to the point about, you can't liberate the oppressor, you can't liberate yourself by becoming the oppressor of the oppressor. That does not mean you can't defend yourself. For the oppressors, however, it is always the oppressed, whom they obviously never call the oppressed, but depending on whether they are fellow countrymen or not, those people, or the blind and envious masses, or savages, or natives, or subversives, or terrorists, that's my added part, who are disaffected, who are violent, barbaric, wicked, or ferocious when they react to the violence of the oppressors. Yet it is, paradoxical though it may seem, precisely in the response of the oppressed to the violence of the oppressors that a gesture of love may be found. Very complex here. Consciously or unconsciously, The act of rebellion by the oppressed, an act which is always, or nearly always, as violent as the initial violence of the oppressors, can initiate love. Whereas the violence of the oppressors prevents the oppressed from being fully human, the response of the latter to this violence is grounded in the desire to pursue the right to be human. As the oppressors dehumanize others and violate their rights, they themselves also become dehumanized. As the oppressed, fighting to be human, take away the oppressors' power to dominate and suppress, they restore to the oppressors the humanity they had lost in the exercise of oppression. Kind of deep. Seems kind of cheesy, seems kind of moralistic. But that's the thing. Freire doesn't say violence is the way to get liberation. But Freire says that it can be generative of the love that is needed for liberation. Because violence by the oppressed is not force. It is not really violence. It is self-defense, right? It's violence as a response to violence. Not with the sense of, I'm going to hurt you back, I'm going to dehumanize you, but in the sense of I need to humanize you because you have dehumanized yourself and are now dehumanizing me, right? Intrinsically, it's both. You have to defend yourself. Right? That's the only way you can set yourself free and the person who's attacking you free is through protecting yourself, right? Getting yourself safety so that you can be fully human. It is only the oppressed who, by freeing themselves, can free their oppressors. The latter, as an oppressive class, can free neither others nor themselves. It is therefore essential that the oppressed wage the struggle to resolve the contradiction in which they are caught. And the contradiction will be resolved by the appearance of the new man, neither oppressor nor oppressed, but man in the process of liberation. If the goal of the oppressed is to become fully human, they will not achieve their goal by merely reversing the terms of the contradiction, by simply changing poles. This may seem simplistic. It is not. Resolution of the oppressor-oppressed contradiction indeed implies the disappearance of the oppressors as a dominant class. However, the restraints imposed by the former oppressed on their oppressors, so that the latter cannot reassume their former position, do not constitute oppression. An act is oppressive only when it prevents people from being more fully human. Accordingly, these necessary restraints do not in themselves signify that yesterday's oppressed have become today's oppressors. Acts which prevent the restoration of the oppressive regime cannot be compared with those which create and maintain it, cannot be compared with those by which a few men and women deny the majority their right to be human. I'm thinking a lot about South Africa here too, right? However, the moment the new regime hardens into a dominating bureaucracy, the humanist dimension of the struggle is lost, and it is no longer possible to speak of liberation. Note 11. This rigidity should not be identified with the restraints that must be imposed on the former oppressors so that they cannot restore the oppressive order. Rather, it refers to the revolution which becomes stagnant and turns against the people, using the old repressive, bureaucratic state apparatus, which should have been drastically suppressed, as Marx so often emphasized. Hence, our insistence that the authentic solution of the oppressor-oppressed contradiction does not lie in a mere reversal of position, in moving from one pole to the other. Hey, Nullbite. Nor does it lie in the replacement of the former oppressors with new ones who continue to subjugate the oppressed, all in the name of their liberation. But even when the contradiction is resolved authentically by a new situation established by the liberated laborers, the former oppressors do not feel liberated. On the contrary, they genuinely consider themselves to be oppressed. Conditioned by the experience of oppressing others, any situation other than their former seems to them like oppression. This is tea here. What's up, Ewiko? This is tea here. Formerly, they could eat, dress, wear shoes, be educated, travel, and hear Beethoven, while millions did not eat, had no clothes or shoes, neither studied nor traveled, much less listened to Beethoven. What's up, Lorenzo? Any restriction on this way of life, in the name of the rights of the community, appears to the former oppressors as a profound violation of their individual rights. Although they had no respect for the millions who suffered and died of hunger, pain, sorrow, and despair. For the oppressors, human beings refers only to themselves. Other people are things. Civil War of the United States, thoughts. For the oppressors, there exists only one right, their rights to live in peace over against the right, not always even recognized, but simply conceded, of the oppressed to survival. And they make this concession only because the existence of the oppressed is necessary to their own existence. This behavior, this way of understanding the world and people, which necessarily makes the oppressors resist the installation of a new regime, is explained by their experience as a dominant class. Once a situation of violence and oppression has been established, it engenders an entire way of life and behavior for those caught up in it, oppressors and oppressed alike. Both are submerged in this situation, and both bear the marks of oppression. Analysis of existential situations for oppression reveals that their inception lay in an act of violence, initiated by those with power. This violence, as a process, is perpetuated from generation to generation of oppressors, who become its heirs and are shaped in its climate. This climate creates in the oppressor a strongly possessive consciousness, possessive of the world and of men and women. Apart from direct, concrete, material possession of the world and of people, the oppressor consciousness could not understand itself, could not even exist. Fromm said of this consciousness that without such possession, it would lose contact with the world. The oppressor consciousness tends to transform everything surrounding it into an object of its domination. Of it. The earth, property, production, the creation of people themselves, time, everything is reduced to the status of objects at its disposal. I want you to keep this in mind. I know it seems pretty redundant. It seems pretty clear. Yeah, the oppressor was always going to think of freedom and true equality as oppression to them, because their only understanding of reality is that oppressor consciousness, them subjugating other people being objects for them to subject, to subjectivize, to act on. But it's key to think about this in deeper ways, like Freire's pointing out, to think about all the different ways that this manifests, because this helps us to recognize when we are acting, for instance, even with violence, but also with lawmaking, with structures of governance, structures of communication, education, when we are imposing ourselves and when we're not imposing ourselves. When to know when we're in the wrong for something we do, when we're being the oppressor, oppressing the oppressor, and when we are liberating both of us. And so understanding that the oppressor consciousness, right, is what we have to beat, right? We have to subjugate that. We have to restrain this oppressor consciousness as much as possible. The oppressor consciousness as much as possible. That's where we direct our force, but not towards taking away somebody's humanity, like giving them no place to live, no health. And that as an act, right? Rather than purely as a type of self-defense in a violent situation. In their unrestrained eagerness to possess, the oppressors develop the conviction that it is possible for them to transform everything into objects of their purchasing power. Hence their strictly materialistic concept of existence. Money is the measure of all things, and profit the primary goal. For the oppressors, what is worthwhile is to have more, always more. even at the cost of the oppressed having less or having nothing. For them, to be is to have, and to be the class of the haves. As beneficiaries of a situation of oppression, the oppressors cannot perceive that if having is a condition of being, it is a necessary condition for all women and men. That is why their generosity is false. Humanity is a thing, and they possess it as an exclusive right, as inherited property. To the oppressor consciousness, the humanization of the others, of the people, appears not as the pursuit of full humanity, but as subversion. Excuse me. The oppressors do not perceive their monopoly on having more as a privilege which dehumanizes others and themselves. They cannot see that in the egoistic pursuit of having as a possessing class, they suffocate in their own possessions and no longer are. They merely have. For them, having more is an inalienable right, a right they acquired through their own effort with their courage to take risks. If others do not have more, it is because they are incompetent and lazy. And worst of all is their unjustifiable ingratitude towards the generous gestures of the dominant class. Precisely because they are ungrateful and envious, the oppressed are regarded as potential enemies who must be watched. It could not be otherwise. If the humanization of the oppressed signifies subversion, so also does their freedom, hence the necessity for constant control. And the more the oppressors control the oppressed, the more they change them into apparently inanimate things. This tendency of the oppressor consciousness to inanimate everything and everyone it encounters, in its eagerness to possess, unquestionably corresponds with a tendency to sadism. Excuse me. Burping a lot. The pleasure in complete domination over another person or other animate creature is the very essence of the sadistic drive. Another way of formulating the same thought is to say that the aim of sadism is to transform a man into a thing, something animate into something inanimate, since by complete and absolute control the living loses one essential quality of life: freedom. That's note 12, that's from Erich Fromm's The Heart of Man. Sadistic love is a perverted love, a love of death, not of life. One of the characteristics of the oppressor consciousness and its necrophilic view of the world is thus sadism. As the oppressor consciousness, in order to dominate, tries to deter the drive to search, the restlessness, and the creative power which characterize life, it kills life. More and more, the oppressors are using science and technology as unquestionably powerful instruments for their purpose: the maintenance of the oppressive order through manipulation and repression. Note 13. Regarding the dominant forms of social control, see Herbert Marcuse, One-Dimensional Man, and Eros and Civilization. The oppressed, as objects, as things, have no purposes except those their oppressors prescribe for them. And if this sounds a lot to you, by the way, to y'all in the chat, like abuse, if this reminds you of abuse, then I think that that's a key takeaway. I think you're onto something. I think one of the best ways to understand how oppression works is to understand it as the collectivized, universalized, systemic, structural embodiment of abuse. The way that abusers act is the way that oppressors act. That's how they act. And thus you can also understand those distinctions that you have to make in your response to the abuser, right? And thus the response to the oppressor. So I like that kind of comparison. Given the preceding context, another issue of indubitable importance arises: the fact that certain members of the oppressor class join the oppressed in their struggle for liberation, thus moving from one pole of the contradiction to the other. Theirs is a fundamental role and has been so throughout the history of this struggle. It happens, however, that as they cease to be exploiters or indifferent spectators or simply the heirs of exploitation and move to the side of the exploited, they almost always bring with them the marks of their origin, their prejudices, and their deformations, which include a lack of confidence in the people's ability to think, to want, and to know. This is key stuff, a great breakdown of like a lot of Western leftism, a lot of US leftists, British leftists. This is how a lot of them tend to think. Like a complete incuriosity about how oppressed people talk about themselves and their lives. Because I know what's best for you. Because I read Marx and I came from this background, you know? And nobody will say that out loud. But you can catch yourself thinking like that a lot. And thus you can catch other people doing it all the time. This is a big problem that I have with Western leftists. You know, and Eastern leftists. I'm not even just speaking about strictly a geographical thing. I'm talking about people who come from these privileged backgrounds, right? From these backgrounds where they've benefited so much from exploitation, including myself, right? Because I'm pretty privileged, right? They decide we want to be on the side of the oppressed, and they can be completely earnest about that. But you're carrying with you the marks of being part of the oppressor class, being part of the exploiter class. You're not going to just transform into having all this consciousness. You know, a way to think about that is like I do sports metaphors all the time. Let's not do a sports metaphor. Let's say you came from opera singing your whole life, and all of a sudden you are like, I'm going to be an R&B singer. I have decided to be an R&B singer. It's not that easy, right? You can decide in full earnestness and work in full earnestness to do that, but a lot of your technique and a lot of your tastes are going to be shaped by your background. And so if you want to more fully become an R&B singer, you have to continuously push yourself to study, to learn from R&B singers, and to stop coming from a position of arrogance, for instance, and seeing how R&B singers sing and saying, that's not the best way to sing that. You know, when you make those distinctions, sometimes maybe you have a point, but a lot of the time you're doing something that is holding you back from becoming an R&B singer. You're not allowing yourself to learn from this different school. You're taking your old school biases with you and then prescribing them onto people here. And that's a problem. That's a problem. What is the left? Genuine ask. Let's keep that question open for a while. Where was I? Yeah, include a lack of confidence in the people's ability to think, to want, and to know. These people won't know better, right? Like, let's be honest, like most people are dumb. You know, these kinds of leftists, right? Oppressed people just don't know what's best for them. Accordingly, these adherents to the people's cause constantly run the risk of falling into a type of generosity as malefic as that of the oppressors. Malefic meaning, you know, moving backwards, malevolent. The generosity of the oppressors is nourished by an unjust order, which must be maintained in order to justify that generosity. You can't have charity from rich people, from nice rich people who do charity, without there being rich people and poor people, right? Our converts, on the other hand, truly desire to transform the unjust order, but because of their background, they believe that they must be the executors of the transformation. They talk about the people, but they do not trust them. And trusting the people is the indispensable precondition for revolutionary change. A real humanist can be identified more by his trust in the people, which engages him in their struggle, than by 1,000 actions in their favor without that trust. And that's like in a relationship. If there's no trust in a loving relationship, it's not going to work. Because it can't just be, I'm doing all the things and making all the decisions for the other person, and they're just helpfully running along for the ride. You know, it has to be that I trust you in your judgment and I take what you say seriously. And if I can't do that, then the relationship's not going to work. In this case, This relationship has to work. And so if you're not able to do it, you can't just break up with the oppressed. A lot of people will do it. People do it all the time. This is what happens when you see the activist turned business person, the person that starts from a radical background and ends up being some sort of political aide to Joe Biden. These types of folks. Those who authentically commit themselves to the people must re-examine themselves constantly. This conversion is so radical as not to allow of ambiguous behavior. To affirm this commitment, but to consider oneself the proprietor of revolutionary wisdom, which must then be given to or imposed on the people, is to retain the old ways. The man or woman who proclaims devotion to the cause of liberation, yet is unable to enter into communion with the people, whom he or she continues to regard as totally ignorant, is grievously self-deceived. The convert who approaches the people but feels alarm at each step they take, each doubt they express, and each suggestion they offer, and attempts to impose his status, remains nostalgic towards his origins. I feel like this is something you can kind of picture this as like a plot of one of those movies where, one of the bad guy turns into one of the good. He's like Zuko. Not. Conversion to the people requires a profound rebirth. Those who undergo it must take on a new form of existence. They can no longer remain as they were. Only through comradeship with the oppressed can the converts understand their characteristic ways of living and behaving, which in diverse moments reflect the structure of domination. One of these characteristics is the previously mentioned existential duality of the oppressed, who are at the same time themselves and the oppressor whose image they have internalized. Accordingly, until they concretely discover their oppressor and in turn their own consciousness, they nearly always express fatalistic attitudes towards their situation. I'm thinking about now, I'm like Avatar: The Last Airbender, reading through Pedagogy of the Oppressed. If you want that for a video, let me know. The peasant begins to get courage to overcome his dependence when he realizes that he is dependent. Until then, he goes along with the boss and says, "What can I do? I'm only a peasant." Words of a peasant. This is note 14. Words of a peasant during an interview with the author. You have to realize that you're dependent in order to start acting on that, to overcome that dependence, right? When superficially analyzed, this fatalism this is where it's so dangerous to tell people that the world is their oyster, that they can be anything that they want, to not teach people about oppression from very young age. This is how it happens, right? When superficially analyzed, I see you, Moni. This fatalism is sometimes interpreted as a docility that is a trait of national character. Fatalism in the guise of docility is the fruit of an historical and sociological situation, not an essential characteristic of a people's behavior. So this is an interesting intervention because somebody had noted earlier, not intervention, but insight. Somebody had noted earlier about how Freire is talking about his specific position as being an educator in Brazil and talking about the Brazilian education system, as we're going to see further on. There's going to be more insight to that. And in the last stream we had conversations about how people in Latin America don't seem to want to know their history. They don't seem to regard their history as important, especially in comparison to the US. People in Chile, people in Brazil, people in the Dominican Republic, in Mexico, look at themselves as inferior, right? And don't have interest in people from their homelands, like with Brazil in the case of Paulo Freire. Don't have the interest in that history and that education and empowering that. And this is where Freire says, yes, there's something to that, but only when we recognize that this is a temporal thing. It's a limit situation. It is not a description of the nature of these people. It is what they've been taught to do. And they have to overcome that. That it's not a part of their national character. It's not just because the Brazilians have a problem and they'll never get better. It's because They are like, the peasant in this situation, which is not me making an unflattering comparison, to be clear. They're in that situation of being oppressed. And so as you have been in that situation of being oppressed, you've never been taught to empower yourself. And you can see that in individual situations all the time. People who have been taught their whole lives that they're not shit, that they're just a kid, that they're just dumb, that they're just not as capable as other people. They can only get the courage to overcome that dependency when they realize that they're dependent. They can only get the courage to recognize their fatalism and to do something about it when they recognize that they are in that situation, that they are oppressed. And to make the recognition that, yes, we are oppressed, but then not really do anything about it, not really engage yourself in acting to change that through study, through dialogue, through making friends, through work, through activism, through resistance, then that only makes the oppression worse. In a lot of cases, as Freire kind of said earlier, it only makes the situation worse because now you're saying, well, let's just accept it. Let's just be docile. I'm just going to be docile. I'm just going to fully embody this oppressed position instead of thinking about myself and emerging from that. And that has a really, really bad impacts. And so that also has to be tied to this idea of the national character that Freire is talking about. It's sometimes interpreted as a docility that is a trait of a national character. I have no doubt in my mind that he was talking exactly about that phenomenon of how Brazilians think, right? It is the fruit of a historical and sociological situation. It's not an essential characteristic. It's not the essence of how Brazilian people are, that they act that way, in this analysis, right? It's a situation that they can overcome. So that's really important to remember, because you have to, when you're in a situation when you are dependent, when you are fatalistic, when you're in a situation where you're saying, what can I do? I'm only a peasant. What can I do? I'm only a girl. What can I do? I'm only a black person. I'm only an indigenous person. What can I do? I'm screwed in this world. Then you start just doing all these things that reify the exact thing that is oppressing you. You just participate in that. But you have to first realize, I'm dependent. You have to first realize, I am the oppressed. And something can be done about it. Something has to be done about it. I have to act in a way to gain more and more of my humanity. It almost always is related to the power of destiny or fate or fortune, inevitable forces, or to a distorted view of God. Another thing that kind of was touched on yesterday about this is how Christianity was. Not yesterday, 2 days ago. This is how Christianity is. This is how Christians think. Christians have this fatalistic view. Freire asserts that that's a distorted view of God. That's a distorted Christianity. Listen to this. Under the sway of magic and myth, the oppressed, especially the peasants who are almost submerged in nature, see their suffering, the fruit of exploitation, as the will of God, as if God were the creator of this organized disorder. And note 15 for this quote, almost submerged in nature. Si Candido Mendes, Memento dos Vivos, a esquerda católica no Brasil. The leftist Catholics of Brazil, right? They see their suffering, the fruit of exploitation, as the will of God, as if God were the creator of this organized disorganized disorder. Step on a Lego, pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. That's great. Great stuff. Submerged in reality, the oppressed cannot perceive clearly the order which serves the interests of the oppressors whose image they have internalized. Chafing under the restrictions of this order, they often manifest a type of horizontal violence, striking out at their own comrades for the pettiest reasons. The colonized man will first manifest this aggressiveness which has been deposited in his bones against his own people. This is the period when the N-words beat each other up, and the police and magistrates do not know which way to turn when faced with the astonishing waves of crime in North Africa. While the settler or the policeman has the rights to the livelong day to strike the native, to insult him, and to make him crawl to them. Excuse me. Let me say that sentence over again. I can't just burp like that. While the settler or the policeman has the right the livelong day to strike the native, to insult him, and to make him crawl to them, you will see the native reaching for his knife at the slightest hostile or aggressive glance cast on him by another native. For the last resort of the native is to defend his personality vis-a-vis his brother. And who said that? Note 16, Frantz Fanon, The Wretched of the Earth, page 52. When you're oppressed, you got no smoke for the oppressor until you realize that you're the oppressed. Recognizing that situation and acting on it, right? You have no smoke for that. So what do? You have all this smoke for the other oppressed. You beef with the other oppressed. You beef with other, people of the diaspora that you belong to, for instance. Fix it in post. You beef with them. We know this phenomenon well. We know this phenomenon quite well. And Fanon's insight there is so important. It's just like such a big contribution. It is possible that in this behavior they are once more manifesting their duality, because the oppressor exists within their oppressed comrades. When they attack those comrades, they are indirectly attacking the oppressor as well. On the other hand, at a certain point in their existential experience, the oppressed feel an irresistible attraction towards the oppressors and their way of life. Sharing this way of life becomes an overpowering aspiration. In their alienation, the oppressed want at any cost to resemble the oppressors, to imitate them, to follow them. This phenomenon is especially prevalent in the middle class oppressed, who yearn to be equal to the eminent men and women of the upper class. Albert Memmi, in an exceptional analysis of the colonized mentality, refers to the contempt he felt towards the colonizer, mixed with passionate attraction towards him. I'm going to make a sneaky note on my phone. Nobody noticed this. So for Memmi. How could the colonizer look after his workers while periodically gunning down a crowd of colonized? How could the colonized deny himself so cruelly yet make such excessive demands? How could he hate the colonizers and yet admire them so passionately? I too felt this admiration in spite of myself. So that's The Colonizer and the Colonized by Albert Memmi. Big stuff. We've talked about the colonized mentality previously as well. I feel like a lot of the stuff we talked about on the last stream just came up in like a page. Self-depreciation is another characteristic of the oppressed, which derives from their internalization of the opinion the oppressors hold of them. So often do they hear that they are good for nothing, know nothing, and are incapable of learning anything, that they are sick, lazy, and unproductive, that in the end, they become convinced of their own unfitness. That's the oppressor in your head. You become the oppressor because you believe yourself to be inferior as well. Thank you, Mano. The peasant feels inferior to the boss because the boss seems to be the only one who knows things and is able to run things. That's note 18, words of a peasant during an interview with the author. They call themselves ignorant and say the professor is the one who has knowledge and to whom they should listen. The criteria of knowledge imposed upon them, are the conventional ones. Why don't you, said a peasant participating in a culture circle, explain the pictures first? That way it'll take less time and won't give us a headache. Note 19. See Chapter 3, page 113, translator's note. Almost never do they realize that they too know things they have learned in their relations with the world and with other women and men. Given the circumstances which have produced their duality, it is only natural that they distrust themselves. Not infrequently, peasants in educational projects begin to discuss a generative theme in a lively manner, then stop suddenly and say to the educator, "Excuse us, we ought to keep quiet and let you talk. You are the one who knows, we don't know anything." They often insist that there is no difference between them and the animals. When they do admit a difference, it favors the animals. They are freer than we are. It is striking, however, to observe how this self-depreciation changes with the first changes in the situation of oppression. I heard a peasant leader say in an asentamiento meeting, "They used to say we were unproductive because we were lazy and drunkards. All lies. Now that we are respected as men, we're going to show everyone that we were never drunkards or lazy. We were exploited." Note 20. Asentamiento refers to a production unit of the Chilean agrarian reform experiment. As long as their ambiguity persists, the oppressed are reluctant to resist and totally lack confidence in themselves. They have a diffuse magical belief in the invulnerability and power of the oppressor. Note 21. The peasant has an almost instinctive fear of the boss. Interview with the peasant. The magical force of the landowner's power holds particular sway in the rural areas. A sociologist friend of mine tells of a group of armed peasants in a Latin American country who recently took over a latifundium. For tactical reasons, they planned to hold the landowner as a hostage. But not one peasant had the courage to guard him. His very presence was terrifying. It is also possible that the act of opposing the boss provoked guilt feelings. In truth, the boss was inside them. The oppressed must see examples of the vulnerability of the oppressor so that a contrary conviction can begin to grow within them. Until this occurs, they will continue disheartened, fearful, and beaten.
New donation from Baru.
Thank you so much for the donation, Baru, or Beru. Note 20, see Regis Debray, Revolution in the Revolution. Or Regis Debray, sorry. Or Debray. As long as the oppressed remain unaware of the causes of their condition, they fatalistically accept their exploitation. Further, they are apt to react in a passive and alienated manner when confronted with the necessity to struggle for their freedom and self-affirmation. Little by little, however, they tend to try out forms of rebellious action. I need to take another note. I'm coming up with all these video ideas, bro. This shit is so powerful. Okay. Little by little, however, they tend to try out forms of rebellious action. In working towards liberation, one must neither lose sight of this passivity nor overlook the moment of awakening. Within their unauthentic view of the world and of themselves, the oppressed feel like things owned by the oppressor. For the latter, to be is to have, almost always at the expense of those who have nothing. For the oppressed, at a certain point in their existential experience, to be is not to resemble the oppressor, but to be under him, to depend on him. Accordingly, the oppressed are emotionally dependent. The peasant is a dependent. He can't say what he wants. Before he discovers his dependence, he suffers. He lets off steam at home, where he shouts at his children, beats them, and despairs. He complains about his wife and thinks everything is dreadful. He doesn't let off steam with the boss because he thinks the boss is a superior being. Lots of times, the peasant gives vent to his sorrows by drinking. Note 23, interview with a peasant. This total emotional dependence can lead the oppressed to what Fromm calls necrophilic behavior, the destruction of life, their own or that of their oppressed fellows. It is only when the oppressed find the oppressor out and become involved in the organized struggle for their liberation that they begin to believe in themselves. This discovery cannot be purely intellectual, but must involve action, nor can it be limited to a mere activism, but must include serious reflection. Only then will it be a praxis. Critical and liberating dialogue, which presupposes action, must be carried on with the oppressed at whatever the stage of their struggle for liberation. Note 24. Not in the open, of course. That would only provoke the fury of the oppressor and lead to still greater repression. So be sneaky. The content of that dialogue can and should vary in accordance with historical conditions and the level at which the oppressed perceive reality. But to substitute monologue, slogans, and communiques for dialogue is to attempt to liberate the oppressed with the instruments of domestication. Someone's asking for me to zoom it more. I think this is 400, so this is like the max I'll go. Let me know if this is okay. Let me know if you guys like this. Okay, this is suddenly okay. The content of that dialogue can and should vary in accordance with historical conditions and the level at which the oppressed perceive reality. But to substitute monologues, slogans, and communiques for dialogue is to attempt to liberate the oppressed with the instruments of domestication. Attempting to liberate the oppressed without their reflective participation in the act of liberation is to treat them as objects which must be saved from a burning building. It is to lead them into the populist pitfall and transform them into masses which can be manipulated. Warning of the dangers of populism. At all stages of their liberation, the oppressed must see themselves as women and men engaged in the ontological and historical vocation of becoming more fully human. Reflection and action become imperative when one does not erroneously attempt to dichotomize the content of humanity from its historical forms. The insistence that the oppressed engage in reflection on their concrete situation is not a call to armchair revolution. On the contrary, reflection, true reflection, leads to action, right? So it's like thinking about how to get better at a game without actually playing it. This is kind of like a Dr. K metaphor, but that's one way to think about it. You're not truly reflecting on how you play the game and how to get better at it if you're not then leading into action with your thoughts, right? With your new thoughts and your reflections. On the other hand, when the situation calls for action, that action will constitute an authentic praxis only if its consequences become the object of critical reflection. In this sense, the praxis is the new raison d'etre of the oppressed, and the revolution, which inaugurates the historical moment of this raison d'etre, is not viable apart from their concomitant conscious involvement. Otherwise, action is pure activism. To achieve this praxis, however, it is necessary to trust in the oppressed and their ability to reason. Whoever lacks this trust will fail to initiate or will abandon dialogue, reflection, and communication, and will fall into using slogans, communiques, monologues, and instructions. Superficial conversions to the cause of liberation carry this danger. And this is something we come across a lot in the left and in leftist organizing, right? It's always, let's do this, do this, do this. If you don't, you're not following the thing. You're not following our program. Our program is figured out already. Let's do communiques. Let's do slogans. Let's do logos, which sometimes are necessary. But we're not going to have the leaders of our movement, which are very much entrenched as our leaders, be engaged in a process of constantly rethinking and in constant dialogue and reflection. We're not going to show that. Political action on the side of the oppressed must be pedagogical action in the authentic sense of the word, and therefore action with the oppressed. Those who work for liberation must not take advantage of the emotional dependence of the oppressed. dependence that is the fruit of the concrete situation of domination which surrounds them and which engender their unauthentic view of the world. Using their dependence to create still greater dependence is an oppressor tactic. Libertarian action must recognize this dependence as a weak point and must attempt, through reflection and action, to transform it into independence. However, not even the best intentioned leadership can bestow independence as a gift. The liberation of the oppressed is a liberation of women and men, not things. Accordingly, while no one liberates himself by his own efforts alone, neither is he liberated by others. Liberation, a human phenomenon, cannot be achieved by semi-humans. Any attempt to treat people as semi-humans only dehumanizes them. When people are already dehumanized due to the oppression they suffer, the process of their liberation must not employ the methods of dehumanization. The correct method for a revolutionary leadership to employ in the task of liberation is therefore not libertarian propaganda. Nor can the leadership merely implant in the oppressed a belief in freedom, thus thinking to win their trust. The correct method lies in dialogue. You're going to see this a lot. The conviction of the oppressed that they must fight for their liberation is not a gift bestowed by the revolutionary leadership, but the result of their own conscientisation. Analysis paralysis, another good term. The revolutionary leaders must realize that their own conviction of the necessity for struggle, an indispensable dimension of revolutionary wisdom, was not given to them by anyone else, if it is authentic. This conviction cannot be packaged and sold. It is reached rather by means of a totality of reflection and action. Only the leader's own involvement in reality within an historical situation led them to criticize this situation and to wish to change it. Likewise, the oppressed, who do not commit themselves to the struggle unless they are convinced, and who, if they do not make such a commitment, withhold the indispensable conditions for this struggle, must reach this conviction as subjects, not as objects. They also must intervene critically in the situation which surrounds them and whose mark they bear. Propaganda cannot achieve this. While the conviction of the necessity for struggle, without which the struggle is unfeasible, is indispensable to the revolutionary leadership, indeed, it was this conviction which constituted that leadership, it is also necessary for the oppressed. It is necessary, that is, unless one intends to carry out the transformation for the oppressed, rather than with them. It is my belief that only the latter form of transformation is valid. Note 25, these points will be discussed at length in Chapter 4. For versus with. What's the difference between you doing something for somebody and you doing something with somebody? The object in presenting these considerations is to defend the eminently pedagogical character of the revolution, or pedagogical. The revolutionary leaders of every epoch who have affirmed that the oppressed must accept the struggle for their liberation, an obvious point, have also thereby implicitly recognized the pedagogical aspect of this struggle. Many of these leaders, however, perhaps due to natural and understandable biases against pedagogy, have ended up using the educational methods employed by the oppressor. They deny pedagogical action in the liberation process, but they use propaganda to convince. It is essential for the oppressed to realize that when they accept the struggle for humanization, they also accept, from that moment, their total responsibility for the struggle. They must realize that they are fighting not merely for freedom from hunger, but for freedom to create and to construct, to wonder and to venture. Such freedom requires that the individual be active and responsible, not a slave or a well-fed cog in the machine. It is not enough that men are not slaves. If social conditions further the existence of automatons, that the results will not be love of life, but love of death. Note 26 from pages 52 to 53. The oppressed, who have been shaped by the death-affirming climate of oppression, must find through their struggle the way to life-affirming humanization, which does not lie simply in having more to eat, although it does involve having more to eat and cannot fail to include this aspect. The oppressed have been destroyed precisely because their situation has reduced them to things. In order to regain their humanity, they must cease to be things and fight as men and women. This is a radical requirement. They cannot enter the struggle as objects in order later to become human beings. The struggle begins with men's recognition that they have been destroyed. Propaganda, management, manipulation, all arms of domination cannot be the instruments of their rehumanization. The only effective instrument is a humanizing pedagogy in which the revolutionary leadership establishes a permanent relationship of dialogue with the oppressed. In a humanizing pedagogy, the method ceases to be an instrument by which the teachers, in this instance the revolutionary leadership, can manipulate the students, in this instance the oppressed, because it expresses the consciousness of the students themselves. The method is, in fact, the external form of consciousness manifest in acts, which takes on the fundamental property of consciousness, its intentionality. The essence of consciousness is being with the world, and this behavior is permanent and unavoidable. Accordingly, consciousness is in essence a way towards something apart from itself, outside itself, which surrounds it and which it apprehends by means of its ideational capacity. Consciousness is thus by definition a method in the most general sense of the word. A revolutionary leadership must accordingly practice co-intentional education. Oh, I didn't read the note. So, note 27, Álvaro Vieira Pinto, from a work in preparation on the philosophy of science. I considered the quoted portion of great importance for the understanding of a problem-posing pedagogy to be presented in Chapter 2, and wish to thank Professor Vieira Pinto for permission to cite his work prior to publication. Okay. A revolutionary leadership must accordingly practice co-intentional education. Teachers and students, leadership and people, co-intent on reality are both subjects, not only in the task of unveiling that reality and thereby coming to know it critically, but in the task of recreating that knowledge. As they attain this knowledge of reality through common reflection and action, they discover themselves as its permanent recreators. In this way, the presence of the oppressed in the struggle for their liberation will be what it should be, not pseudo-participation, but committed involvement. That's the end of Chapter 1. Everybody make some noise. Woo! And so we'll get to Chapter 2 in the next stream, which, again, I'm not sure of the time when that's going to happen, but maybe it will be tomorrow, maybe it will be Monday. I'm aiming for it to be either tomorrow or Monday. This stream will be uploaded onto my Reading with Elliot channel. Hello to the viewers on that channel. I hope you enjoyed today's reading. Some closing thoughts. You see now Freire's talking about these really important aspects of, revolutionary action, changing the world. Being in great deal changing yourself, right? People talk often about you have to change yourself to change the world. And you have to have confidence. And a lot of these things have been sort of co-opted by the structures of capitalism so that they encourage people to become more like the oppressors, right? We have to become confident. A lot of what makes us do things that aren't very good but feel good in favor of doing things that are very good but are hard to do and don't feel very good are the constructs that we have in our brain that we are not able to really do anything that matters, that we are not capable of growing in these important ways, that our actions are not that important. When you realize that your actions are important, when you realize that you can act on the way in a way that can, you can act on the world in a way that can change it for good. When you realize that you are just a human being, just like anybody else, just like the people who oppress you. Yes, there is the sense that, yes, you have to learn how to not oppress the oppressor. This is huge. But that thought is not separate from the reality that you have to stop oppressing yourself. You have to stop oppression outright by becoming confident, right? Becoming confident in your ability to overcome your situation. How do you overcome your situation? By recognizing that it's a situation. It's a limit situation. It is not forever. It is not permanent. How do you recognize who you are and how you can change things? By knowing the context that you live in. You understand your subjecthood, which you can use to change the world, by understanding how you're objectified, your objectness, which you have to have an understanding of both. It's like, I realize that I'm tall, so I should play basketball, right? As a very crude example of that, right? Recognize the objective parts that you can't change, the objective parts that came before you, that shape the world around you, that make you who you are, that you are, at the end of the day, to a great deal adherent to. And then say, what's the part that I can change? What can I start doing to change that? So a lot of this stuff can be very feel good and very kind of generalized, but it also gives us clear insights into the problems that we encounter as trying to be leftists. We want to dunk on people, which sometimes is necessary. It's kind of like dunking on people is kind of like violence in a way, right? Sometimes it's necessary to rehumanize yourself, to rehumanize the people who are made objects, who are made dehumanized, right? Sometimes dunking on people is good, but if all we want to do is dunk on people and make other people objects, thusly oppress other people that oppress us, we don't get anywhere. Only when we realize that both of us are human, that I need to put myself in a situation where my humanity can more clearly be recognized and established, can we do anything. And so that's basically all the time I have today. There's so much more to say. I mean, it's just a very rich text. But honestly, before, when I used to read this book, I always felt like the first chapter was like the only thing that could keep my attention and was like the best part. But now I like get more and more excited for how we go on and on, because I feel like we're going to see how many of these concepts evolve and turn into these deeper things, right? We got these concepts to start, and now they're just going to unfurl more and more into these, you know, maybe slightly more concrete, but also just fascinating, more like reflections on our actual world. So stay tuned for that. And let's be in touch. Yeah. Let's see you for the next stream. And thank you for supporting the channel. Thank you for being here, and have a great day. Bye. I think you're onto something. I think